Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to Dangerous Waters, Part 2 in our studies of Kapitel Kuf Chav Dalet, Psalm 124. Tonight's class has been generously sponsored by Les and Iris Friedman to commemorate the yahrzeit of Les's mother, Bluma Bas Naftali, Aleh HaShalom. And I have to say that as you will see, as we will progress in our studies of Kapitel Kuf Chav Dalet, Psalm 124, the content of what we will be learning about tonight and the life that Bluma Bas Naftali led has a chilling connection. A chilling connection. She was a Holocaust survivor. She bore the scars of her terrible suffering, including the tattoos, that tattoo of the numbers tattooed on her arm. And she went on to raise a family. And this is the triumph of the Jewish people, despite the horrible suffering that was inflicted upon us in the raging waters that followed, or that inundated and engulfed us. So with no further ado, let's get right into it. In our first segment of Kapitel Kuf Chav Dalet, we talked about the hatred that's directed against the Jewish people. And it's kind of a Thanksgiving psalm because despite it all, we have continued not only to outlive, but in fact to triumph. And this is a bit of a Thanksgiving kind of Kapitel of Tehillim, because in it we acknowledge that Lule Hashem, if not for Hashem being with us, Shahayolanu Bekum Aleinu Adam, when people rose against us, they would have swallowed us alive. And today we're going to shift or move forward and focus on the raging, treacherous waters, which, as you see, are a metaphor for the enemies of the Jewish people and the genocidal machinations that they directed against us time and again. So with no further ado, today we are continuing segment 2 with the study of verses 4 and 5. Azai hamayim shtafunu. So at this point, then, the waters would have inundated, or the waters would have inundated us or overwhelmed us. Nachla over al nafshenu. Now, let's translate this as a torrent or a current that would have surged over our souls. So let's take it from the top. What does it mean when we say Azai Hamayim? Then the waters. Who are the waters a metaphor for? Clearly this is euphemism. The question is who are we referring to? Forgive me for a moment just to get all my Sefer open over here. So we're going to begin with a look at the Ibn Ezra, who says that the word Azai Hamayim Shtafunu is a reference not to the difficulties or the challenges, but rather the enemies themselves. The enemies are metaphorized as waters, as the Ibn Ezra says, Dimo hatzoirer lenachal. The tzoirer, the person who sought to do us this harm, is metaphorized as a raging river. A nachal sheitif, a water of raging, river of raging waters that swept over us. We see something similar in the Metzudas David, who also refers to the concept of the mayim that went over us. He says, Hamayim dima hamoin ha'oivim l'shtifas mayim rabim. And here the Metzudas David gives us a little bit of insight as to why we're talking about raging waters, right, plural. He says because we have oivim, hamoin ha'oivim, an enormous amount of enemies, many, many enemies. And the enemies are metaphorized as raging waters. Similarly, although Rashi here does not comment at all, he doesn't really speak about this concept of hamayim, who the mayim are a metaphor for. However, it's interesting that in the book of Shir HaShirim, we have something similar, although it's not really the same thing. In the 8th chapter of the Song of Songs, verse 7, the pasuk, the verse reads, Mayim rabim lo yuchlu lechabais es ha'ahava. Great waters cannot extinguish the love. Unahares lo yishtafua. And raging rivers cannot inundate or overwhelm it. So, I mean, clearly we're using euphemism here and metaphor. And Rashi, in his Shir HaShirim commentary, says, Mayim rabim ha'umais, that we're referring here to the many nations, and presumably these are the nations who stand against Israel. Unahores, he says this does not refer only to the nations, but rather the waters are sorehem umalchehem, their magistrates, their princes, their leaders, their political, shall we say, leaders, and their kings. That's who we're talking about. And lo yishtafua, he says, al yedei chayzek ve'ema, through this enormous amount of pressure and trepidation that they seek to impose upon us, that they're not able to overwhelm us. And interestingly, the Targum in Shir HaShirim also says, he begins almost with like an explanatory kind of preface, and he says, Omar Morei Ol Mala'ame. The master of the universe said to his nation, Beis Yisrael, Aluli miskansin kol amamaya de mitil lamaya. Even if all the nations, who are metaphorized as water, would rise up against you, like the maya, the yama, like the waters of the oceans, the inun sagian, which are enormous amount of water, layochlin limitape yos rachme minoch. They would not be able to turn the love away from you. The imiskanfin kol malchayara, and if all of the kings of the lands, the matil lamaya, who are metaphorized as water, would come the nahara as a raging river, the nogid biskoif, who come with great force, la yuchlon lemim chayasach ma'alma, they will not be able to liberate you from the world. So we have this idea that the Mayim Rabim refers to many nations, and the concept of the Nahares, of the river, that cannot inundate or overwhelm, is referring to the leadership. So once again, it seems very clear that we have this metaphor, a persistent metaphor in scriptural writing that seems to refer to the concept of Mayim as water, as the tzorer, as the oyev, as the one who inflicts damage or has machination or rises up against the Jewish people. The Sefer similarly says, when he speaks about this chapter of Tehillim, and I have to tell you that the Sefer has an unusual approach. The Sefer seems to emphasize, I have to find the Sefer, here it is. The Sefer, as we learned in the previous episode, he sees a sprinkling of Roman persecution here, whereas most of the other Mefarshim speak about either Egypt, and we'll speak about more tonight, or speak about the Persian persecution that preceded the miracle of Purim, or the Assyrian Greek persecution that preceded the miracle of Hanukkah. In the Sefarno's view, this also alludes to Roman persecution, and specifically he names Adrianus Caesar, or the Caesar who stamped out Hadrian, the Caesar, that's the monster who hated Jews with such force that he massacred hundreds of thousands of school children and schools, as the Gemara describes in great detail. And Hadrian is the one who cursed us by naming the land of Israel or Judea Palestina, a curse we still suffer from till today. So he says that Azah HaMayim, this is the remnants of the armies of Hadrian after Bar Kokhba fought against him. So they were raging over us, he says, like a river. And the Sefer goes on to say on the next pasuk, which we'll come to later, he says that Hadrian decreed that anybody who wouldn't kill Jews would be killed themselves. Similar to kind of Nazi Germany, where if you save the Jewish life, you're risking your own life. At any rate, the point that I'm making here is that once again we have another one of the Rishonim who sees within the concept of the water or the river, he sees people, whether it's nations or leaders of nations, but people who seek to harm the Jewish people, the anti-Semites who seek to harm the Jewish people. And a final point in this area is something that's brought down in the name of the Rekeach, and here he links this psalm to the events of Purim, Now, we talked about this in the previous episode, the idea of that the word azai shows up thrice here. It shows up at the beginning of verse 3, it shows up at the beginning of verse 4, and it shows up at the beginning of verse 5. The same word heralds all three of these verses in succession. And azai has the gematria of 18, because Aleph is 1, and Zayin is 7, and Yud is 10. It's not, you have to be a rocket scientist, so that comes out to 18. So 3, 3, and 3, as we talked about in the previous episode, the Eretz Chaim says in the name of the Arizal, this refers to 3 Shmon Esreis, the Amidah service that we daven every day. So if you have Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv, or 3 Amidah services, 3 times 18 gives you 54, and he says that this is the idea of the Shmon Esrei that seeks, that brings us Hashem's bracha. So, but here's another point that I want to share with you now. So the Rekeach says that Haman's name is mentioned 54 times in the Megillah. And he says this is referring, this is David HaMelech's prayer to save us from Haman and from the 10 sons of Haman, because he says in the list of Haman's 10 sons, the list contains 54 letters. And as we talked about in one of the classes on the Megillah, if you go to that particular class which talks about the hanging of the sons of Haman, there's a direct allusion to the Nazis who persecuted us and the way the Nuremberg trials worked out, where there's an allusion to the year and the details of that as well. So there's like a modern day connection between the Haman of old and Haman's sons and the Nazis, including Julius Streicher, Yamach Shema V'Zichro, crying out, Purim Spiel 1946. And he said, now I go to the gallows. Everybody else was actually faced a firing squad. And it was only these 10 Nazis who ended up on the gallows like Haman's sons. At any rate, so the Rekeach says that the number of 54 is, therefore, comes out with the name Azai, Azai, Azai 3 times. And this is a reference to the amount of times that Haman and Haman's sons are mentioned. It's also interesting to note that Rekeach says that if you take a look at this chapter of Tehillim, you have 57 words, but if you take out the first 3 words, which are repetitious, Shir HaMa'alot LeDavid, because all 15 either being with Shir HaMa'alot or Shir LaMa'alot, if you take out those 3 words, you end up with 54 words in the chapter of Tehillim. So it's pretty incredible. 54 words, 54 times Haman mentioned, 54 letters in Haman's name, and a direct allusion to the Tzorer, to he who sought to stamp out the Jewish people. So this is one approach in the Rishonim, and whatever, it doesn't exactly say this. I just collated this going through everything. I found that like you have Ibn Ezra, you have Metzudas David, you have Rashi and Shir HaShirim, which is based on the Targum there, you have the Sefarno, and finally you have the Rekeach. You have 5 of the different commentaries which are referring to the Mayim as the anti-Semites or enemies of the Jewish people themselves. Conversely though, just because we should have what we call Shleimus of the Milsa, full picture. So in the full picture, there are a number of the great Rishonim who understood these waters as a metaphor not for the political leaders or the specific individuals, but rather for the difficult times themselves, that the waters are a metaphor for the times itself. And we have, for example, the Radak, Rabbeinu David Kimchi, in his commentary on Tehillim, he speaks about these raging waters, and he says, Azai Hamayim Mashal Litzarot. This is a mashal, this is a metaphor, this is a euphemism for the suffering. It's not speaking about those who inflicted the suffering, it's speaking about the suffering. So that's interesting to note that that's the way the Radak sees this. The Radak is not the only one. The Ma'am Lois cites Rabbeinu Yosef Chiyun, the Rebbe of the Abarbanel, who says about this verse, Umetayr hatzarot kemo mayim. He depicts the suffering, the difficulty, the narrow straits we faced like water. So once again, we have this emphasis. And finally, Rabbeinu Moshe Alshich, in his commentary, and we're going to talk a lot about his commentary a little bit later on, because he specifically identifies the difference between the first waters and the second waters. But the Abarbanel, the Rabbeinu Moshe Alshich, also says, Sha'azai hamayim heim hagzerot, that the mayim are the decrees. not the decreers, not the people who prosecuted these machinations against the Jewish people, but the machinations themselves, which sought to overwhelm, to harm, and to liberate and destroy the Jewish people. So this is a little bit of a different take. So we have some of the Rishonim who speak about the concept of the tzorer, the subject, the people, the anti-Semites, the enemies of the Jewish people who actively persecuted the Jewish people and tried to harm the Jewish people. And we have another view where it's not talking about the individuals, but rather this is referring to the idea, the persecution itself. Maybe like in the parlance of yeshiva land, it's like the difference between the gavra and the chefza, between the subject and the object. One is talking about the objective reality of the suffering that we faced, and the other is talking about the subjects who carried out that suffering or that persecution against the Jewish people. Okay, either way you learn it, clearly this is a metaphor, and the metaphor that's chosen is these raging waters. And in verse 4 he says, Hamayim shtafunu, the water inundated us, and then we have the word nachala avar al nafshenu. Now, what is the meaning of the word nachala? Very interestingly, Rashi, and that's the preeminent straightforward meaning, Rashi says that nachala is lashon choili, refers to a profound sense of weakness. Illness means when you're not able to function. So he says a profound sense of weakness, illness, or dysfunction swept over us. Because of the suffering, we were disabled, we were weakened, we were not able to function as we could and should have. And that's the idea of nachla avar al nafshenu. Now, this is something in the Migdash Ma'at, he cites this in the name of Razal, our rabbis of blessed memory, although it doesn't cite Rashi, which is pretty interesting. He says, Nachal lashon chayli. He says this is for our rabbis of blessed memory, and we'll come back to the Migdash Ma'at a little bit later. But at any rate, the same idea is also spoken about by the Alshich, where the Alshich says that the word of Nachala is Shenachala v'chil bilvad over al nafshenu. He's going to make a distinction between the first water and the second water, and he says the second water is fear. Refers to a tremendous amount of paralyzing fear and trepidation that swept over our people, and we'll come back to the Alshich to see what that means, but I just thought it's interesting that the Alshich also does not see the Nachala in the terms of an actual river. However, with the exception of Rashi, and with the Migdash Ma'at quoting the name of Razal and Alshich, everybody else seems to read this as river. So it's waters, raging waters, and then like a torrent or a current or some kind of river. Let's take a look at the Ibn Ezra, for starters. So the Ibn Ezra says that the concept of nachala, he says, milas nachala al shloisha drachim v'kulam shenim. The word nachala can be understood in three different ways. Interestingly, he does not talk about the concept of weakness per se. He says the idea of nachla could be understood in three different ways, and he says, I shouldn't say, he does say chayli, the second way is chayli. So he says like this, the first nachla which we find in the Torah, the idea of nachla, is about Yerusha, about inheritance. This is very common. This is found multiple times in the Torah, where it's talked about. In fact, according to the Mesorah, there is no less than 40 times in Tanakh where the word nachala shows up in the terms of heritage, legacy, heirloom, or inheritance. Then we have the idea of chayli, which apparently shows up 4 times in totality in the Tanakh, which is the way Rashi takes it over here. By the way, I should point out also that the Targum and Tehillim uses the word that shatafu, maya shatafu, raging waters, and then he says, maris ovra al nafshana. Maris is a euphemism, the word for like evil or bad, a weakness. It probably means weakness. So it seems like the Targum understands this as a weakness that overcame us, and that's what Rashi means when he says lashon chayli. Rashi is probably, in my guess, following the Targum. But the Ibn Ezra says that there are 3 different possibilities, and the third possibility, he says, is indeed a river. And the Ibn Ezra says that here it's speaking about a nachal, a gorge, or a brook, or a raging river. And he says that's the way the Ibn Ezra sees it. He looks at the vowelization, and he says by virtue of the vowelization, that's what we would have to suggest. Now, I'm going to guess that Rashi doesn't take that approach, first of all, because the Targum doesn't take that approach, but also because you're repeating yourself then. And as it is, we repeat the idea of Mayim Hazidonim in verse 5. So you're saying raging waters and a Nachla Avar al Nashenu. What's the difference between Hamayim Shtafunu and Nachla Avar al Nashenu? Therefore, Rashi says it's not focused only on the vowelization, but he says focus on the syntax. Syntactually, there has to be something else that's being conveyed to us. So he says raging waters weaken, inundate, overwhelm, and they weakened us. He says this is what Atzaros did to us. They weakened us, they overwhelmed us, they inundated us, and they disabled us from being able to function properly. Many other Rishonim do not follow this approach. For example, the Radak also, Rabbeinu David Kimchi, in his commentary here, he says that this refers to a nachal shotif, waters that are flowing with great force, rapids, torrents, with great force. And he says, he also follows the vowelization. He's very similar to Ibn Ezra. He says, following the vowelization, that would be the right approach. Interestingly, the Metzudas David here as well does not follow Rashi's approach. Metzudas David says that the nachala refers to nachal mayim haya avar al nafshenu, a raging river of raging brook or rapids passed over our souls. Now, of course, we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean? Now, here's something that I found that's very interesting. If we're going to talk about nachala, so nachala from the term of brook or gorge or raging water, intermittent raging waters, has only one precedent. And the only other precedent in the Torah itself is to be found in Numbers 34, Bamidbar Lamed Dalet. And this is really interesting. So, in Bamidbar Lamed Dalet, we have Parshas Masay, the last Parsha, last Torah portion of the book of Numbers, and we get the description of the map of Israel. What are the borders of Israel? So in verse 5, it speaks about the southwestern border of Israel. The western border of Israel, of course, is the Mediterranean Ocean. Israel's entirely on the coast. The entire western border is the coastline. And then the southwestern border, he says, is we go down in the corner of Atzmain to Nachala Mitzrayim, to the Nachala of Mitzrayim. So it's not Nachal, but it's Nachala, just like we have it here. And this is the only other example of where Nachala, Nun Ches Lamed Hey, Nachala, is seen to be referring to a river. Now the question, of course, is, where is this border? Where is that southwestern border, and what is this Nachala referring to? Rashi does not say. He does not say with clarity in Chumash Bamidbar. But, very interestingly, in the book of Yehoshua, Rashi does say. Over there, in the 13th chapter, in the book of Joshua, we have description of the areas of Eretz Yisrael that Yehoshua captured. And in verse 3 of the 13th chapter, it says, Min ha-shichur asher al pnei Mitzrayim, from the shichur which is on the face of Egypt, which means this is where Israel borders with Egypt. This is very close, by the way, to the name Rafiach, which has become very popular today. Everybody knows Rafah. All eyes on Rafah. Well, all eyes should have been on Bibis, but whatever. But anyway, the Rafiach crossing is very close to this. That's actually the border of Eretz Yisrael, Israel, and Egypt. And that's Al Pnei Mitzrayim. So that would be the northeastern border of the land of Egypt, which would comprise the southwestern border of Eretz Yisrael. So what is this? Rashi says, Min ha-shichur hu Nilus. This is the Nile. Hu Nachal Mitzrayim. The Nile is the brook or gorge or intermittent waters of Mitzrayim. So Rashi identifies it as the Nile River. And this is not the Nile Delta. This would have to be kind of northeast of the Nile Delta. And the best theory I could come up with is that there are multiple rivers or flowing tributaries which are identified as Nile. But it is a part, an eastern tributary, a northeastern tributary of the Nile River itself, which empties into the Red Sea. So that Rashi is very clear about this. Incidentally, Rabbeinu David Kimchi the Radak, in his commentary on the book of Yoshua, is also very explicit about this. He says, Min HaShichur Hu Nilus. This is the Nile. Nachal Mitzrayim. So both of them are calling this Nachal Mitzrayim, and therefore the assumption is going to be that we are referring to, when it says Nachala, back in the book of Numbers, where it speaks in verse 5 about the border of Eretz Yisrael, and it says over there, Nachala Mitzrayim. So Nachal Mitzrayim and Nachala Mitzrayim, Bepashtos, it would seem, are the same place. Okay, that's what Rashi says, that's what Radak says. However, very, very interestingly, there are other Rishonim who sharply disagree. For example, the Ibn Ezer, in his commentary of the Parshas Masai, says Nachal Mitzrayim einenu haya'or. El Nachal Mitzrayim, to the brook of Egypt. And the brook of Egypt, he says, is not referring to the Ya'or. The Ya'or is the way the Nile River is described. He says it's not the Nile River. And Rabbeinu Bechaya ben Asher, Rabbeinu Bechaya II, in his commentary on Parshas Masai, also says something very similar. Koloimar el Nachal Mitzrayim. Nachal is like the Nachal of Mitzrayim. Ve'einenu haya'or. It is not referring to the Ya'or. So what is it? Rabbeinu Bechaya doesn't say. Doesn't say, and neither does Ibn Ezra. However, very, very interestingly, in the translation of the Torah that was rendered into Arabic by Rabbeinu Sadia Gaon, who precedes all of these Rishonim, Rabbeinu Sadia says, Nachal Mitzrayim vad el Arish, known in modern day as Wadi el Arish. Now, Wadi el Arish is a brook of water. There is like a little bit of it seems to be like an intermittent and ephemeral river, sometimes raging, and sometimes it dries out like a wadi. And the question is, where is Arish? So the Vashturi Haparchi, who wrote his Sefer Kafta V'Ferach, he was in Eretz Yisrael in the 16th century, and he actually described like over 80 places in Eretz Yisrael that he was in, and he described the borders of Israel. So he maintains also, like that Rabbi Sadia says it's El Arish, and he says that Arish is Arabic for huts, and that this refers to Sukkot. This is where the Jewish people came to just when they escaped Mitzrayim, and they made the kind of hastily put together huts over there, which is the original Sukkot, and he says this is Sukkot. Now that's certainly not the Nile River. So it's Wadi El Arish. If it's Wadi El Arish, it's not the Nile River. It's a brook. I mean, we do know approximately. We know where Arish is, and we know where Wadi El Arish is. Arish is it's today in the northern border of Egypt, very, very close to Rafah, very close to the border with what the world calls Gaza. Yes, it's Israel, according to the Torah, and that seems to be actually a border area. It may well be the border area. Now, I'm not 100% sure about this. I don't think anybody could be 100% sure about this, but I have this like hunch that maybe when what Rashi's calling the Nile, Nilos, it's again just like the Ibn Ezra doesn't say Einoi Nilos. He says Eineno Haya'or. It's not the Ya'or. It's not the main Nile River. It's not the Nile River, the famous Nile River where the babies are thrown into. It's not the famous Nile River that ran red with blood. But he doesn't say it's not the Nile. So I have a feeling that there is a link. That they're all called Nile. So it may in fact be called Nile, and maybe in today's day, the Ibn Ezra Sadia Gaon is simply identifying where it actually is. Nobody calls it Nile today. Today it's called Wadi El Arish. But Wadi El Arish could be, in biblical times, was referred to as a tributary or part of the wider Nile River. Now, why is that relevant? Who cares? Who cares if it's called Nile or it's not going to? Well, clearly, first of all, the Rishonim care about it, and we have Rashi telling us, and the Radak telling us that it is the Nile. And again, you have Rabbeinu Bechaya ben Asher, and you have Ibn Ezra, who are telling us it's Nachal Mitzrayim ve'ena haya'or. They know, neither of them say it's not the Nile. They don't say it's not the Nilos. They say it's not the Ya'or. The Ya'or is in Egypt. That's the main, I guess we'll call the Nile Delta. So it's not the Nile Delta, but they don't say it's not the Nile. And when the Psaj Gaon tells us Wadi El Arish, he's simply telling us what it's actually called. That's what it's referred to. So it is technically referred to as El Arish or Wadi El Arish, but I don't think that that's a contradiction to it being the Nile. Why would it have to be? What do we gain out of making it the Nile River? Why is it relevant even? So here's something very interesting. And again, I'm just like kind of putting these pieces together. I don't really know what I'm saying with certainty. I'm just kind of guessing. But this is perhaps what you could call an educated guess, or an educated kind of like link together. So one of my online students sent me a Sefer, which is a commentary on the book of Tehillim, and it has something called Eitz Hadas Tov, which is said to be from manuscript of Reb Chaim Vital that was in the possession of the Sfas Emes, of the Ger Rebbe. And then there's also a commentary called Sfas Emes from the Ger Rebbe. Actually, it says over here that this was printed from manuscript, which was in the possession of the Imre Emes, which was the Ger Rebbe, fourth Ger Rebbe. So I don't know. I'm presuming that it is what it is, and it is what it says, and that this is from Reb Chaim Vital. Whose yard set, by the way, is like today or something. So Reb Chaim Vital, and I'm lifting this out of voluminous commentary on this chapter. He says that this mayim, that this water, this raging water, which ran over us, he said this is a reference to the decree Kol haben hayalud haya'ora tashlicho, that every baby who is born should be thrown into the Nile River. So this is referring to the very first anti-Semitism, the first Jew hatred that was directed against our nation before we were even a nation. That already they were throwing our babies into the river. And he says that's the meaning of Azai hamayim shtafunu. Then the waters inundated us. They literally inundated us. Avad al nafshenu. And we drowned in these waters. But the whole chapter of Tehillim is about that Hashem was with us, right? That's how this chapter of Tehillim unfolds. We say that Lule Hashem shahaya lanu, if not for Hashem having been with us, right? Lule Hashem shahaya lanu b'kum aleinu adam, when a man arose against us. And we already learned in the previous episode that Adam can easily be referring to Pharaoh. And many of the Mepharshim actually interpret that as a reference to the Pharaoh. So what does it mean that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was with us? So in this Pirush, Eitz Hadas Tov, it says that Hashem Yisbarech, in His great mercy, redeemed and saved the souls of these children who were thrown into the Nile River. And he says there were 600,000 babies who were thrown into the Nile River and drowned. 600,000 were thrown in at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. And he says, V'kulam alu imay bizchusay. They were all saved in the merit of Moshe. V'le avru miyamei nachal nilus al nafsham. The waters did not rob them of life. Hashem miraculously saved them. And the truth is, this is not a new idea. This is a very old idea. This idea of the children being saved from the river and being miraculously, eventually restored to their families. This is a Medrash Rabbah. This is found in the Medrash Rabbah in Bereshis in chapters 97, where it says this clearly. So Reb Chaim Vital is using that Medrash Rabbah, and he's reading into our chapter of Tehillim, and he says, here we have David HaMelech speaking about the babies who were murdered by the taskmasters, the Egyptians, led by the Pharaoh, as they rose against us. But Luli Hashem Shaya Lanu, God was with us, and the children were saved. So that's the first very interesting thing he says. And again, all right, so how does this work out? If Wadi al Arish is not the it's not where they threw the children into. So I don't think it has to mean with the children. This my thought process is that it's all called Nile. It's euphemistic. So that Nachal Mitzrayim is referring to a different tributary of the Nile, area of El Arish, or Wadi El Arish. But the point is that we are euphemistically recalling, David HaMelech is euphemistically recalling the idea of the Nile River, which is called Nachal Mitzrayim. Nachal Mitzrayim in its various forms. The way it shows up in Parshas Masai, it's Wadi El Arish. That's the border of Eretz Yisrael on the southwestern side of the land of Israel. But Nachal Mitzrayim ultimately is a reference to the Nile. It doesn't have to be the same Nile. The point is, it's all called Nile. These are the waters of Mitzrayim. So this is one approach. This is the approach which as I said, that I found in this commentary, which is attributed to Reb Chaim Vital. And that's what David HaMelech is in this Thanksgiving psalm. That's what he's talking about. They tried to drown us. They tried to overwhelm us, try to throw us into the water, and Hashem saved us. And of course, the rest is history. We are then born as a nation, and the Jewish people have exodus from the land of Mitzrayim. And by the way, this idea of calling it the Nachala of Mitzrayim is rooted in what we're going to call the Targumim themselves, because the Targum Onkelos in Parshas Masay, he says me'etzmain lenachala de Mitzrayim. He just says nachala, and he spells it with an aleph instead of a hey, so it's Aramaic, or Aramaic sized, but he doesn't tell us where it is. However, both the Targum Yerushalmi, which has been misnamed Palestinian translation, I have no idea why, or the Targum Yonasan ben Azil, both of them say that we're referring to the Kesam, and Kesam is a reference to, or a translation of the word Atzmain, it's called Kesam in the Targum. It says from Kesam, and the Targum Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Targum says Lenilus de Mitzraye. Or the Targum Yonah ben Uzziel says Mikesam Lenilus de Mitzraye. So we are referring to the Nile, both in the Targum Yonasan as well as the Targum Yerushalmi. True Targum Onkelos does not refer to it in that way openly. Rashi, in his commentary on Parshas Masay, simply says that we're talking about the Nachla, the Mitzrayim, the Miktsayim, Aravas Dremes, the river, or the brook, or the stream, or the gorge, or the intermittent rapids that are in the area of the southwestern border of the land of Israel. And so clearly we're talking about the border of the land of Israel. The Ur was not the border of the land of Israel. That was very much in the heartland of what we call Egypt at the time. Nonetheless, we see that Chazal are referring to it as Nilus, and it kind of lines up with the way the Chaim Vital learns the Pshat in this pasuk and in this chapter of Tehillim. Okay, so verse 4 then is saying, Azeh Amayim Shtafunu, the waters inundated us, they raged over us. Nachla Avral Nafshenu, whether you say weakness washed over our people, or whether you say Nachla refers to a euphemism of an actual river. And according to the Chaim Vital, the reason that we're referring to that, it's a direct reference to the Nile River, and that's why we'd be referring to Nachala to specifically identify which raging waters we're referring to when we talk about this inundation. However, and this is very important to say, there needs to be a differentiation. There's this Aze Avar Amayim Shtafunu, the waters inundated us, and then it says Nachala Avar Al Nafshenu, the either the weakness, and I guess according to Rashi, weakness is something that's nefesh related. We feel exhausted. We feel our nefesh is exhausted. So the first part we're talking about our body. It says Hamayim Shtafunu raged over us, and then Nachla Avar, a weakness came over of Nashenu. How does water rage over a soul? What does it even mean? Water can rage over a body. What does it mean water rages over a soul? That's where Rashi takes his approach, that Nachla means weakness. But many Rishonim say, no, the Nachla is to be taken quite literally, and it means a raging water. So how do we understand that? What is David HaMelech trying to say? So, very, very interestingly, in the commentary of Rabbeinu Moshe Alshech, he explains these raging waters as not referring to the Pharaoh, but these raging waters as referring to the Persian persecution of the Jewish people. This is the pre-Purim era. And he says like this, Azai Hamayim. What are the Mayim? As I mentioned earlier, he does not read the word water or euphemism or metaphor of water as a person, a political leader, a leader of the anti-Semitic charge, but rather of the difficulties themselves. He says, this refers to the Gzerot, Shatafunu, washed over us, inundated us as gufeinu, in a very physical, material, corporeal way. And he says this is a euphemism to describe the Hamanic decree that Esther Hamalka and Mordechai saved us from by the grace of God. What was the decree of Haman with the willing participation of the king Achashverosh? The willing decree, the decree was lahashmid, laharog, ula'abed. We're talking about genocide. We're talking about destruction. We're talking about murder. The murder of the Jewish people. So what happened? Why was Haman not successful? And the simple read of the story is that Haman planned this a year in advance, or 11 months in advance. Mordechai finds out about it. He lets Esther know immediately. They together begin the fasting. Eventually, over the course of the next 3 days, Esther engineers this ingenious plan that Haman falls right into, where Achashverosh is convinced that somebody's out to get him, and Haman seems to be the fall guy, and the queen is way too close and friendly with him, and he's very suspicious, and then Haman unwittingly gives in to those suspicions, and he indicates that he'd love to be the king, and in the end, the king flies into a rage, especially when he sees Haman fall upon Esther, begging for his life, and he says, aha, you're trying to seduce the queen in my palace, and Haman is hung. Now, what happens to Haman's decree? So it's not simple. Esther comes and she says, Achashverosh, we got a little problem here. And he says, well, nothing I can do about this. This is like, it's a done deal. It's law. It's been signed into law. So Esther says, well, can we make another law? Achashverosh says, I don't know. So they have to get another law in place. And the other law is that the Jewish people can defend themselves. Now, the Persian Pony Express is the original swift way of getting the word out. There was no more detailed highways, a royal highway, than the Persian Pony Express. It's like an unbelievable thing. It's a famous thing that they built this incredible system of roadways with like a Pony Express, quite literally, and they were able to get the message out very, very quickly. So Mordechai, on the 23rd day of Sivan, which is not that long after the original decree, just the next month after the original decree is hatched in Nisan, this is now barely 2 months later, has a new decree written, and the runners go out. The runners bring the decree everywhere, and in the end, that's how the people get saved. Now, what would have happened if Haman would have made his decree applying instantaneously, like beginning now, lahashmid lahareg abe, tomorrow? That would have been a big problem. So Hashem ordains it that he doesn't, and that there's time for us to do tshuva and earn God's good graces, and then bring about the miracle of Purim. So the Alshich says that the first waters, the raging water, was the water that washed over us, that raged over us of planned genocide. And then he says there was a nachla. What is a nachla? And he seems to follow Rashi's approach, a weakness that came over us. Avar nafshenu. What's the weakness that washed over our souls? He says this is a reference to the 3-day fast. In the 3-day fast, we didn't eat for 3 days or 3 nights. So we were in a weakened state. But Nachla Avar al Nafshenu was the greatest blessing, because Nachla Avar al Nafshenu, Azai at that time, when Hamayim Shtofunu, when the raging waters inundated us, that's when Nachla Avar al Nafshenu, that's when the weakness came over us, meaning we fasted. And Al Yedei Kach, Al Yedei Nitzulunu, through this we were saved. If they would have set forth a hand to kill us, to murder us, to commit genocide against us right away, then we would have been finished. So this way we had time to respond. And in the time we had to respond, we fasted, we did tshuva, and then Hashem brings about the great miracle of Purim, that all of Esther's plans happened to work exactly as she hoped they would, which was like incredible and miraculous. So he says the Alshich, Hilule Hashem, if not for Hashem, that Hashem, Shahayu Lanu Laharech, that Hashem gave us time to be able to engineer things. Nimlatnu Mibale Bechira, we would not have been saved from those who chose to perpetrate the genocide and the murder against us. So that is the way we understand this verse. According to the Alshich, That's the meaning, the difference between Aze Amayim Shtafunu refers to the planned genocide of the Jewish people, and Nachar Aval Nafshenu refers to the fasting, the tshuva, and the transformation that was brought about. However, he says, in the third Galus, which refers now not to Galus Mitzrayim, not to Galus Bavel. Bavel and Persia are one, but the next Galus, which is Galus Yavan. So here, things didn't work out so well. Over here, there was a shift. And that he says, the Alshich says, that's how we understand the Pshat in verse 5. Azai avar al nafshenu hamayim azidenim. The first time he says nafshenu refers to our fasting. He says, then avar al nafshenu. So what's the difference between verse 4, where the mayim shtafunu, the waters rage over our bodies, and then verse 5, where then the waters raged over our souls? Now Alshach says something amazing. He says, once we got to the next major galut, we went from Purim, we went into the Hanukkah story. The story of Hanukkah, Loi hoya kisha'ar golius. It was not like the other exiles, which the other exiles up to this point, shahoita kavanatam ala guf, they were trying to physically destroy the Jew. But here, it was not to physically destroy the Jew. The Assyrian enemy did not mind if we continued to live in the land of Israel. He didn't mind if we had a national identity, as long as it was a-religious, as long as it was not monotheistic, as long as it was not based on revelation, and as long as it wasn't supra-rational. As long as we would take our place amongst the pantheon of idolatrous nations and worship the God of our own image or the God of our own creation, they were going to be just fine with that. So it was a war, a persecution, not against the physical existence of the Jewish people, like it was in the previous iterations of Galut. Here it was the war against the soul of the Jewish people. Here they wanted to destroy the faith of the Jewish people. That's a major shift. Hanukkah is the first time we face something like this. This was against the religion of the Jewish people, against the spirituality of the Jewish people. And he says, Kol yisham v'chol chayfetz lahavir al dos. Their whole desire, their focus was not to physically kill us, not to liberate the physical existence of Jewish people, but to drain that Jewish people of any vestige of spirituality, to cut us off from our God, as the famous Medrash Rabbah that tells us that they said, Eimru li Yisrael kisva keren asher, write, inscribe on the horn of the ox. In other words, proclaim and trumpet out, Ein lechem chelik belikei Yisrael. You have no portion in the God of Israel. And the Jewish people, v'hayisrael moisrim nafsham al kiddush Hashem. The Jewish people, many of them, paid with their lives and refused to abandon the faith of the Jewish people. And that's the Azeh Avar al Nafshenu. This was the raging waters that went against our soul, he says, because here the Gzeira was against our soul itself. So that's the way we understand these various challenges that the Jewish people faced. And I think it's noteworthy that when we speak about the concept of Hanukkah and Purim, we are speaking ultimately about the challenges that will face the Jewish people until the coming of Mashiach. They're either going to try to destroy us physically and materially and corporeally, or they're going to try to destroy us by virtue of assimilation, and they're going to try to destroy our souls. And that's why we observe Hanukkah and Purim till this very day. Because in one we see the hidden hand of Hashem as they try to destroy us physically, and the other we emphasize how they seek to deracinate us from our spiritual roots. They seek to rip us away from our heritage and our legacy of spirituality, our faith in Hashem, and this too must be fought against. And we have to know that in the end, we will be able to maintain the purity of the oil, and the light of Yiddishkeit will burn forever. And that's really why we observe Hanukkah and Purim. We don't need new holidays. Hanukkah and Purim commemorate the eternity of the Jewish people. It commemorates the triumph of the nation of Israel over every possible set of circumstances. Once we have Hanukkah and Purim, we, so to speak, we have it all covered. It's either going to be in the image of Hanukkah or Purim or both. So this is the the way we understand the raging waters and the metaphor of the torrent and the currents that came across us, and the distinction where the first time the waters are shtafunu, there's the nachla avar al nafshenu, and then in verse 5, azai then avar al nafshenu hamayim azedenim, and of course I'll remind you what the Rekeach says, that the whole thing is referring to Purim, and Purim of course sets the tone for the eventual challenges, difficulties, and then from travail to triumph in the time of Hanukkah. So here's something very interesting. I was thinking about this, and I was thinking that really and truly, all galuyot, every image of galus everything is in the image of Mitzrayim. Whatever we're going to experience, or whatever we have experienced over the course of time and the sweep of Jewish history, it's already there in Mitzrayim. And I remember this famous talk about the Rebbe about the Nile River, but before I go there, as a kind of a bridge, which I thought of this before, but here's the interesting bridge. The bridge is that in the Malbim, when he talks in his commentary Tfilos David, he says like this. He says, I am azamayim shtafunu. He says that Sha'oz be'es shaloi chara apam banu. He says, verse 3 already talked about their anger that raged against us, were like wild beasts they sought to devour us. He says, but then it goes over to water. He says, what's up with the water? And he says, the water, the torrential pressures are not persecution, but it's the tide of assimilation. That's the waters we're talking about. It's the cultural pressure. And the Malbim maintains that this is to try to draw us in, to inundate and overwhelm us, so that we become one nation with everybody else. So we are no longer separate and apart. We do away with the havdalah, with the distinction, set the Jewish people aside. And that's the waters we're talking about. And by the way, this fits so beautifully with the words of Shir HaShirim of the Mayim Rabim Leyuchlu Lichbeis, where, I mean, interestingly, it doesn't say, he says the nations and he talks about Sarim and Macheim, but he doesn't speak about physical persecution. He speaks about the pressures that were brought. By virtue of the force and the pressure, I think this might refer to assimilation. And the Malbim clearly speaks about that. And he says, this is the nachal. What is the nachal avar al nafshenu? He says the emphasis is lo al aguf. This is not a challenge to the body. This is a challenge to the soul. That's what we're dealing with over here. And say, azay avar al nashayim hamayim azidenim, that this is referring to the crashing waves of assimilation. It's interesting, till today we refer to assimilation as the tide of assimilation. People actually use that kind of language. And he says this is trying to overwhelm us into a state of kfirat hadat, that will deny our faith and our religious connection to Hashem. And he says this is referring not to physical genocide or liberation, but this is referring to the destruction of the soul of the Jewish people. I thought that was very interesting. And that's the whole water metaphor. That's what the metaphor changes. He says earlier we had, the metaphor was that if as a chaim blunu, they would literally swallow us alive. They said that's referring to like physical persecution. But then we switch. So my thought was that I remember this very famous sikha. I mean, every chassid knows that this is the first edited sikha on Parsha Shmos, where the Rebbe focuses on the verse in which the Pharaoh gives instructions to his people, and he says that kol haben hayaloid, every boy who is born, haya'ira tashlichu, you throw him into the Nile River. Remember, Nachala, Nile, it's the Nile River. And then it says v'chal bas, but all the daughters to Chayun. So the Rebbe said, tzlib vasat pare gedarft oisfirin v'chal bas to Chayun. Why does Pharaoh have to say, and the daughters, you'll make them live? right? Means a lozen leben detected, let the daughters live. Obviously, let the daughters live. You're only killing the boys, so the girls are going to live. And he seems to be emphasizing not simply to leave them alone, but in addition to the fact that all of the naye geborene, all the newborn boys who are going to be born, so man reinwerfen in Teich, they should throw them into the river. Und das wird sein, was mit sein mit den Töchter is nicht interessiert. What will happen to the daughters is of no interest to the Pharaoh. He's interested in killing all the baby boys because he knows there's going to be a redeemer born from amongst the baby boys, and he heard it's going to be a boy. It's a man, so he has to make sure the redeemer doesn't come. So why do you have to say b'chol habas techayun? So the Rebbe reasons that the very fact that the Pharaoh emphasized habas techayun tells us that that's part of the decree. And therefore the Rebbe says that the word techayun, if you want to precisely translate, means ihr sollt sie lassen leben, ba leben. You shouldn't just leave them alone. Let them live. Give them life. Enable them to live. And the Rebbe explains that the Pharaoh's decree was such that the selbe Mitzrayim, that the very same Egyptians who prosecuted the Jewish people, hat angesagt, sollen reinwerfen idische Kinder in Teich, that they should throw the Jewish babies into the river, the infanticide of hundreds of thousands of Jewish babies. Along with this, abzutake the Nachmanu Latzan Zerguf, to kill them physically, hat sie euch angesagt, he said, when he gave to the Sheres HaPlate, the remnant, which will be the female babies, as a velm balebim, that you will make them live. In other words, that the Mitzrayim, that the Egyptians are going to ensure that they will be brought into the stream and flow of Egyptian culture and life, which means upteit nachman al-tzan zeir neshama, to kill them with love, with assimilation, to marry them and bring them into the thrust of Egyptian life, make them a part of the Egyptian reality. And that's why the Rebbe says earlier, when there's a decree where he asks or instructs the Jewish midwives to kill the babies, he just says you leave the baby alone. The girls v'choy, the girls will live. But here it's techayun, and therefore the Rebbe says v'chola bas techayun is nitkin klener gzeira, is no less of a decree against the Jewish people. It is no less baleful. It is no less harmful. It is no less dangerous, because here we're killing them physically, and conversely, they're going to be killed spiritually. And the Rebbe cites in a footnote that there's this concept that's brought down in Derech Chaim and Chassidus from the Mittler Rebbe, that kosher misa ruchnius yoisem and misa gashmius, that spiritual death is worse than physical death. And he says there's even a Medrash Tanchuma, which is cited in Pirush Rashi, which says, Hamachti la'adam kosher le'min ha'hargoi, that a person who causes somebody to go on the path of sin and disconnects him from God is worse than physically killing him. In other words, this whole business of the Nile and the raging waters can be understood on two levels. So it all starts with Nile and Egypt, and it filters into the story of Purim and the story of Hanukkah. All of this is alluded to already from the first moment, and that's how Reb Chaim Vital interprets these raging waters as the Nile River, which a Nile River can be understood quite literally, or the flow, the ebb and flow of life, the raging waters of assimilation in the time of Egypt. So the girls would be assimilated, the Egyptians would marry them and turn them into Egyptians, and the boys would be dead, and there'll be no Jewish people. That's the end of the Jewish people. And that's the business of the raging waters. And then we see how the Al-Shlach interprets this to refer, or to euphemistically be recalling both the story of Purim as well as the story and the miraculous deliverance of Hanukkah. Which takes us into the completion now of verse 5. Azai avad al nafshenu hamayim azadonim. Then those raging waters came over us, says the Radak. Omar, it says, Omar hamayim k'may loy zorak olav. As if, not that it did come over us. It would have, if not for Hashem standing in our way, it's in their way and protecting us, it would have overwhelmed us. It would have totally inundated us. We would have been liberated by its raging, by the Mayim Azidanim. And very interestingly, he says Mayim Azidanim refers specifically it's translated as treacherous waters. He says this is upirush hazidonim sheshoftin beresha ubezadin. This is the acts of treachery against the Jewish people. And this is very chilling because it really brings us into our modern day and age. You know, it's Rabbi Yosef Chiyun says that we refer here to the Galut in the time of Egypt. We refer in the Psalm to the Galut in the time of the pre-Purim era, and he says we refer to our present exile. In our present exile, we see that bodies like the United Nations, UNRWA, the International Court of Injustice, and all of the other organizations were behaving so treacherously towards the Jewish people. The women's rights groups all over the world who are very worried about women, except if they happen to be Jewish living in Israel, then they don't count. The treachery against the Jewish people has reached like an all-high. And this is exactly what David HaMelech refers to when he speaks about Azai Ovid al Nashayim Amayim Azadim. Then those treacherous waters, the treacherous waters speak specifically to the treachery which is perpetrated against the Jewish people. The Mitzudas David says, Hashaitfim bizodin u'beresha. These are the waters that flow, that inundate, that rage against us with treachery and with evil. And he says this is repeated thrice, 3 times. Azai amayim shtafunu, nachla aval nashenu, azai aval nashenu. We have it's repeated thrice, lehischazkos, to strengthen the message. And the Mitzudas David says this is really derech hamalitza b'chol makim. This is generally speaking the way when David HaMelech speaks in poetic prose, things are emphasized for emphasis, repeated time and again. And he says here we have this business of the treachery and the evil perpetrated against the Jewish people that's being repeated in a number of different ways, in a number of different times, with multiple messages, but ultimately the message is one and the same. Our enemies try to destroy us, and Hashem saves the Jewish people. And here we are to tell the tale. So that's the story of the dangerous waters, or the raging waters, the treacherous waters, or all of the above. And ultimately, this is a psalm of thanksgiving. It's a Shir HaMa'alot in which David HaMelech thanks Hashem that Lule Hashem Shahayu Lanu. We must remember, my dear friends, that in the end, we are here today and we have survived and not only have managed to still exist, but we have triumphed because Hashem is with us. That is the secret of our eternity. It's not that we have the strongest army or the most effective diplomacy. It's not because we are clever. It's not because we are courageous or strong. We may have many of those qualities as a gift from Hashem, but ultimately it is Lule Hashem Shahayu Lanu. It is only because Hashem was with us. And because Hashem is with us, despite the fact that they rage, despite the fact that they inundate, despite the fact that they try to destroy us in a variety of different ways, ultimately HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there to protect, to shield, to save, and to bring the Jewish people through it all, as we will continue Be'ezrat Hashem next week in our final episode with Baruch Hashem Shaloi Nesananu Teref L'Shineim. We thank Hashem who does not allow us to become proverbial prey in their teeth. We're going to hear all about that. Now we're going into the third concept of metaphor. We're going to talk about the idea of teeth. We're going to talk about the concept of nafshenu, kitzipar nimuta, that we have escaped like the bird. And we ask that Hashem continue to help us, the maker of heaven and earth, as we say, to be continued, Be'ezrat Hashem. That comprises part 2 of Psalm 124. And may Hashem help us that we not only survive these last dark and difficult days of Galut, but Be'ezrat Hashem, we triumph by moving into the end of the story, the final chapter, which is the coming of Mashiach, b'meheira u'b'yameinu, speedily and in our days. Amen. Thank you so much for joining. If you aren't yet, please subscribe, please share it with friends and neighbors, and please share this class as widely as you can so that we're all inspired to know that despite the challenges that face us, we have and we will continue to overcome, to survive, and to triumph. Laila Tov. Gute Nacht.